This is Roboquest, a roguelite FPS currently in early access where you play a robot fighting other robots in a series of levels. It's pretty simple on the story front right now, although there is a somewhat intriguing story that is presented. It's of course in early access, so it's not finished yet in terms of the narrative and all that, but it does seem like it may have some kind of neat twists in an otherwise somewhat neat world to learn about through the story if you want to do that. But as far as the gameplay goes, this is a very smooth, very fast-paced first-person shooter in the roguelite style. So, you have multiple runs. When you die, you start over from the beginning, but you do have a sort of meta currency in the form of these this scrap, they look like wrenches, that you can collect that allow you to upgrade your base camp and unlock new things in between runs. The first kind of big thing that attracted me was the art style. You can kind of tell already that just looking at the UI elements and things that it is presented in a somewhat like graphic novel / comic book style, and in fact even the story cutscenes take place in like comic book panels, that sort of idea. And the actual art style of the game itself is very saturated, very colorful, highly stylized. It looks really nice actually. The texture quality and everything under all the stylized shaders is actually really nice as well, but that's not really as important as how cohesive and colorful the whole thing is. It's very nice looking while also importantly still being readable. One thing that is I find kind of difficult oftentimes is if you have a very stylized, bright art style, especially in a first-person shooter, things can sometimes get so colorful and hectic that it's actually a bit tough to figure out what's going on occasionally because there's just so much happening on screen at any given time. But that's not the case in this game. Although it does get very fast-paced, very hectic, it's never hard to read despite being very stylized, which is, I think, a nice accomplishment for the developers to have actually reached, because that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. But the other thing that really attracted me to the gameplay here was, well, the gameplay itself. It's very fluid. It's not just fast-paced, but it feels very satisfying, very responsive, because you're fast. You're like classic FPS fast. You can move around at very high speed, and that's without sprinting. While sprinting, you move even faster, and you have a double jump from the beginning. You can hop off of enemies' heads to stun them and give yourself some extra air. There are jump pads and things around the levels, and there are even these rails that enemies can use and that you can use yourself and sort of grind along them to get some extra speed or just kind of get out of areas. And there are in fact some boss fights where the usage of these rails is necessary, actually jumping from rail to rail to sort of stay in the air, basically playing the floor as lava, because in one particular boss fight I can think of, the floor actually is lava. All in all, really, the game feels very Unreal to me, by which I mean the game Unreal and Unreal Tournament. The general fluidity of movement, the shooting overall and everything does feel Unreal-esque in terms of how it actually operates, which is nice because there's a very fluid, solid game to actually base your movement system off of. And if that's one of the main influences in terms of all that, then it makes sense. And in fact, I kind of think it is, because you can even find a weapon called the Unreal Gun, which is basically the shock rifle from Unreal Tournament and Unreal, which allows you to, it has the beam, the instant hit beam on the primary fire, and the alt fire that allows you to shoot out that like shock orb, and then if you fire the beam into the orb, it explodes and does more damage in an area. All that sort of stuff is here. So yeah, I think Unreal is definitely a big inspiration for the game in terms of its mechanics and its overall feel, and that's a good thing because it shows in pretty much every aspect from the movement to the shooting that this is definitely clearly inspired by a more old school FPS way of doing things, your sort of arena FPS, your painkillers, your Serious Sams, your Unreals. That kind of DNA is what really seems to be throughout this game as a whole, which is pretty neat. As for how it all works from the beginning, you will be in a sort of base camp area that is, as I mentioned, upgradable. This is your sort of meta upgrade system that a lot of roguelites have. You can collect this scrap I mentioned to unlock new elements, from upgrades to the number of weapons that you can hold at a time, to the upgrades in terms of, what you're going to start with per run, so that you can start with a bigger selection of possible things, and other things like that. And you will choose a loadout, which is basically a class. There are 3 currently in the early access, and there are more planned, including a loadout creator, which I'm intrigued as to what that's going to entail. That sounds cool. And the loadouts change your melee attack, they change the skill that you have access to, and some of the level up upgrades also change depending on which loadout you're playing. There's also this interesting stats-based system. If you see those colorful numbers in the bottom left of the screen above your health gauge, those represent the stats that you start with and can obtain from getting these relics and things throughout the game. And these determine your damage and basically what sort of things that you're going to want to focus on. In order from the left to right, you have assault, precision, demolition, technology, and ability. Those are what those colors mean. And you can find these relics that you can equip that will increase each of those stats in different amounts. You start with 2 assaults to begin with, And like I said, this is sort of determining your damage, except for ability, which determines the effectiveness of the actual skill that the loadout you've chosen starts with. But the other ones are for weapons. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, the weapons also have colors, which denote what stat they influence their damage from. So right now I'm using a lot of blue weapons, which is technology. So the higher my technology stat is, the more damage each of these weapons is going to do. You can also find flexible weapons, which are nice, that have 2 colors, and they just pull from whichever of those 2 stats is the highest. And that's pretty nice to find because it enhances the variety in overall weapons that you're willing to use, because you may come across a weapon that is normally a precision weapon, but say you're playing a technology build that run, so you may find a variant of that weapon that is flexible and either pulls from precision or technology, so that allows you to use it and get the bonus from your technology stat despite it normally being a precision weapon. That sort of idea, it just enhances build variety and things, so it's nice. And these stats are very important because the overall health of the enemies that you're going to be fighting ramps up quite quickly. So you're going to need all the extra damage you can get. So finding these relics that enhance your overall damage capabilities, and of course using weapons that match the highest stats you have, is important to your survival. As far as the weapons go, there's a pretty good selection. They tend to be quite varied, with each stat type having its own sort of theme. Assault weapons tend to be your sort of bread and butter bullet-using weapons, often rapid fire. Technology weapons are often energy, things like beams, that sort of thing. Demolition are, of course, explosives and the like, oftentimes, or weapons with explosive capabilities, or a flamethrower. And precision are your snipers, your bows, your sort of single-shot high-damage weapons, often with a lot of range. So there's a good amount of variety in the weaponry, and you do have infinite ammo, which is really cool. Some weapons do need to be reloaded, and some have a sort of heat meter. Often the energy weapons use that sort of heat-up mechanic. But regardless of which specific type you're using, they all have infinite ammo, which is a very nice thing. But some weapons do have a secondary fire, and that is actually limited. You do have ammo, but only for the secondary fire of weapons. Now, most weapons don't have a secondary fire, but currently, of the ones that do have it, they tend to be pretty neat, actually. And they can be anything from a carbine that can fire an explosive shell forward, to a double-barreled shotgun that can fire out like a blast of shrapnel that sets things in front of you on fire, to the aforementioned Unreal shock rifle weapon. Now, you will notice that when enemies die, they drop all these blue orbs, and these are actually extremely important because they serve 3 different functions that are all very useful to you. The one less obvious function is that at the end of every level, you're graded on your performance in that level based on the time it took you to clear it and the amount of orbs that you gather. And this is nice because if you get an A or an S ranking, you get extra wrenches to spend back at your base after the run is over. But the other more immediate uses of these orbs are that, one, they recharge your class's skill. The skill that you have is not cooldown based. You actually have to collect these to recharge it to be able to use it again. And the other one is that they actually act as your experience, so you need these to level up. Leveling up is extremely important because your enemies will get stronger quite quickly, so you need to get stronger as well. And every time you level up, you'll get a bit of extra health and damage, as well as, depending on which level you are, either a choice between some perks or a choice between a sort of stat up. It changes every other level which one you get. So the first time you level up, you'll get a perk, the second time the stats, and so on and so on. And the perks are really useful, actually, because they tend to be quite powerful. They can be everything from upgrading your class's skill in some way, to making your different damage types work in different ways, making certain things do extra damage types than they normally do. There's all sorts of them, and they're all really nice. And the stat ups are also pretty important because of the aforementioned enemy scaling that happens, and they are a choice between some extra maximum health, +1 to each of those stats to increase your damage, or plus some points to your ability score. So yeah, the leveling up is very important, so collecting these orbs is also important, and they do fade after a fairly short period of time, so you need to be on the ball, and that is of course very much integrated with the fact that this game is very fast-paced, very acrobatic. You're moving around all the time, standing still is death, so moving around constantly, killing things, collecting all these orbs is all very important. So yeah, movement is very key to the whole experience of the game. It seems like they're very much clearly going for that whole like acrobatic movement style that makes every fight a large arena with lots of stuff for you to interact with and move around in, from those rails, the jump pads, to of course all the enemies themselves. Like I said, that's sort of like the Serious Sam / Painkiller influence, I think, coming through, along with the Unreal influence, that makes the game overall just kind of a blast to play. It's one of those games that once you actually die and end your run, you sort of just now realize that your heart has been going like triple the normal speed for the entire time, and you've been like in the zone just destroying everything. It's that kind of game that makes you focused on the precise elimination of everything in front of you, while also never stopping, never standing still, and being constantly aware of all the projectiles coming your way and all the different ways that you're going to need to deal with each different type of enemy depending on what sort of weapon you're holding at the time, all that stuff. It's just a really fun FPS, honestly. And I think that in its current state, in early access, it's a really good base for building upon to actually improve. So obviously what I like to do in my early access videos is not only describe the current state of the game, but also try and think of some things that I would like to see, some things that either I think need improvement or just things that could be different or added to or whatever, because it's in early access, so there's room for improvement. That's part of the point. And one of my main complaints right now is the fact that enemies scale up very quickly and can become very bullet spongy in the later levels. And that's a problem that a lot of, RPG-infused FPSs can have pretty easily, is that enemies, sometimes the harder enemies especially, can feel like they're taking a lot of bullets to take down. But in the case of this game, the later levels really are filled with large hordes of enemies that take a lot of damage before they finally go down. Things get very bullet spongy. And the side effect of this is that, generally speaking, you're going to choose one of those 4 main weapon stats and stick with that and only use weapons of that stat for most of the playthrough, because you already have a bit of a problem keeping up with how fast the enemies scale up if you're just focusing on improving one stat as high as you can, let alone if you were to actually split that in between multiple different stats, because you do have 2 and eventually 3 weapon slots. But if you were to split yourself that thin to sort of try and have a couple of stats that you're focusing on instead of just one, it's just not going to work for you. The enemies scale up way too quickly for that to be really feasible, in my opinion, and you really need to just choose one that you're going to stick with and try and get as high as possible during that playthrough, and only be using weapons for the most part from that particular stat. Otherwise, the overall scaling up of the enemy's health is going to just pass you by and things are going to get way too hard to kill. I think it could be a little better in this regard. I think that enemies could scale up a little bit less quickly and become a little bit less bullet spongy, or your strength could scale up a little bit more easily. Overall, I just think there's a bit of a disparity, a growing gap between the amount of damage that you can reasonably do and the amount of health that enemies have, to the point where eventually they will become very spongy feeling, and that's, given the high-speed nature of the game, it's a bit unsatisfying to have to, go up against enemies that are really, really spongy when the action is so fast already. Having to spend all that much extra time on each individual enemy kind of dampens the enjoyment a little bit, so I think that there is some room for improvement when it comes to the sponginess and overall feel of the later game enemies and how difficult they get to kill in relation to the overall increase in strength that you experience and how much extra damage that you can do. Another thing that I think would be kind of cool to see, and honestly I expect this to already be in the works, it's more than likely already planned, but I figured I'd mention it anyway. I think that right now you start with 2 points in Assault, no matter what loadout you choose, and I think it would be better if each loadout had a different stat spread to begin with. The traditional bread and butter Assault class that you can start out as, the Guardian, would make sense to have those 2 points in Assault, but for instance the Engineer, I think it would make more sense if they started, for instance, with, say, 2 points in Technology, or if the Scout started with 2 points in Precision. I just think it would help to improve the overall variety and individuality of these loadouts if they had their own sort of stat spreads to start with. I would also like to see as many weapons have alternate fires as possible, even if not every weapon had an ammo-using limited alternate fire, even if some of them were just using the weapon in a different way that used its normal ammo supply instead of the limited one. I think, the game already has that Unreal Serious Sam DNA to it, so I think embracing that fully and giving as many weapons alt fires as possible would be cool. Even the starting pistol could have an alternate fire that, maybe fired a less accurate but really fast spread of 3 shots. The Junk Beam could fire a shotgun-like energy blast short range in front of you that could deal with multiple enemies at once but heated it up very quickly. The dual crossbows could use the alt fire to shoot both crossbows at once instead of firing them one at a time, which would of course deplete its ammo supply twice as quickly, but would, if you were confident enough that both would hit the same target, would increase your overall burst damage against single targets. So yeah, that sort of idea, I think that alt fires for as many weapons as possible would really help to improve the experience, because, well, I like alt fires, and this game does already have that old school shooter running through it, so I feel that just as far as additions go, that's one that would make sense to me. It would also just improve the overall variety of the experience, give each weapon some extra utility, that sort of idea. Alt fires are fun, and I think they fit within the mechanics of this game really well, so having more of them would be cool. Also, I think it's begging for some more acrobatic maneuvers, like dashes on the ground, and especially an air dash. As fast as you already are, having the movement be even more like Unreal Tournament influence with air dashes and the like, I think would be super cool. I mean, you can already get a jetpack and you have a double jump, so air dashes don't seem that far out of the realms of reasonable possibility, and I think with the way the movement system is already so fluid and nice feeling, that would take it to another level, having that extra air mobility and the like. And also, I think it would be, this is just sort of like a spitballing idea, but I think it would be kind of cool to be able to find rare hybrid weapons. Sort of like the flexible weapons now that have 2 stats, but pull from whichever one is highest, depending on, you know, what you're using when you equip it. Having a weapon that is a hybrid, 2 stats, but uses both of them at once. For instance, these could be like rare drops that you occasionally find, but they'd be one of those extra things that just improves that run for you and gives you some extra variety. You could have some sort of like crazy slag cannon thing that's a technology demolition hybrid weapon that pulls from both of those stats and has a primary fire that shoots like a rapid fire burst of like hot slag, and then a secondary limited fire that shoots a piercing beam forwards that does good burst damage against everything in like a narrow line in front of you. Just that sort of idea, that kind of extra weapon variety that pulls from multiple stats at once to sort of improve your chances of maybe finding some really interesting stuff. You know, a lot of roguelites go for having the occasional somewhat rare artifact or weapon that is just out there, that's just a bit different, that is like the high point of that run if you're able to find one. And I think as far as this game's mechanics goes, that would be a good solution to that idea. Although, looking at the roadmap, there are some interesting sounding features like corrupted weapons. That sounds neat. I have no idea exactly what form that's going to take. So yeah, I think this is a really solid base for a very fun roguelite FPS that has very satisfying combat, very fluid movement, and a really nice bit of weapon variety that is just ripe for improvement and additions as it updates through the system. And the first major update looks like it's going to be adding some really fun stuff, and that's coming in the fall. So that is Roboquest. I will of course link you in the description to this video to the Steam page so you can go and check it out yourself. And thank you guys very much for watching. I'll see you next time.